For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a designee of the Majority Leader pursuant to House Resolution 5, I call up House Resolution 11 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 11, resolution establishing the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party.
Pursuant to House Resolution 5, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader or their respective designees. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on House Resolution 11.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of House Resolution 11, a resolution establishing the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. This Select Committee will be charged with addressing the urgent threat to the United States and our allies posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Mr. Speaker, the ongoing threat posed by Communist China and the fact that the CCP cannot be trusted as a global partner has been apparent to the American people for some time. In 2019, at the behest of then Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, House Republicans created the China Task Force to review Communist China's actions and to make policy recommendations to protect U.S. interests against the Chinese Communist Party. Republicans sought to make this task force bipartisan and extended an open invitation to Democrats to join us, but unfortunately House Democrats chose not to participate at that time. I hope they do at this time. The China Task Force ultimately produced a report with more than 400 policy recommendations, many of them bipartisan. Today, we're taking the next logical step with the creation of a select committee empowered to investigate and respond to the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat that threatens our very way of life. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, the Chinese Communist Party has demonstrated time and time again that it is more interested in being America's foe than America's friend. The events of the past 3 years have brought into stark focus how Communist China's actions affect the United States and the rest of the world. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began inside China's borders, the world has experienced constant disruptions and chaos. Indeed, Communist China's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic is emblematic of its approach to many other things, attempting to cover up the pandemic's existence, resisting all efforts to investigate its origins, committing horrific human rights abuses, and refusing to work productively with the global community to combat the pandemic. It's also become apparent that far too many economically critical supply chains are tied to China, which threatens our economic and national security. We are dangerously dependent on China for basic building blocks of our economy. The result is shortages of critical products like semiconductors and rare earth minerals, both of which are largely produced in China today, along with the shortages of pharmaceuticals and personal protective equipment, which threatens our ability to battle future pandemics. Our national and economic security requires us to secure our vulnerable supply chains and indeed to bring them back home to America. Communist China has also undertaken aggressive actions designed to expand their influence both in the United States and abroad. Communist China is a prolific thief of American intellectual property, violating countless patents and failing to respect international and domestic intellectual property laws. They have undertaken a systematic effort to infiltrate American colleges and universities through their support of the so-called Confucius Institutes and other organizations designed to spread Chinese propaganda. Chinese spy networks operate both on American soil and in cyberspace, and popular Chinese-owned apps like TikTok spread more propaganda and take massive amounts of Americans' personal data back to the Chinese government. In addition, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has spread the tentacles of the so-called People's Liberation Army throughout the world, particularly the developing world. and has ensnared dozens of developing countries in debt-trap diplomacy. Communist China continues to aggressively push into the South China Sea and militarize small islands, threatening freedom of navigation in this strategically important region. And they relentlessly and aggressively provoke Taiwan, an island that demonstrates to the world what a free, democratic, and capitalist China could look like. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is Communist China is a serious generational threat that we must address before it's too late. China exhibits expanding economic and military power coupled with the uncompromising rejection of our values and those of our allies. That's why the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party is critical. It will be charged with reviewing our economic dependence on China and restoring safe and secure supply chains, on reviewing China's actions toward the United States and our allies, on restoring American domestic institutions to protect them against Chinese infiltration and propaganda, and so much more. I urge all members on both sides of the aisle to join me in support of this resolution so we can stand united against Communist China. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think before I begin, I'd just like to ask any of my Republican colleagues whether anybody found the secret 3-page memo detailing all the concessions that were made to the most extreme elements of the Republican conference. Anyone? I heard that Speaker McCarthy told members during a closed conference meeting that there is no official document or 3-page addendum to the House Rules package detailing these concessions. But none of us ever said it was official. If it was official, it would have been in the official rules package. But I also took note of the fact that in Axios today, we saw this. It says, one thing the document doesn't contain, according to NRCC Chair Richard Hudson, who said that he's seen it, is promised committee chairmanships for specific members, quote, no names, just representation on panels, end quote. So we were able to find out from Mr. Hudson what's not in that secret memo, but it would be helpful maybe before the end of the day if we could actually get the document so that the American people know what was promised. In any event, Mr. Speaker, China has the second largest economy in the world, and there is no doubt that their government seeks to extend their sphere of influence and export their model of authoritarianism abroad. The question is, how should the United States respond? For the past 4 years, I've served as chair and co-chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. We have monitored China's compliance with international human rights and rule of law standards. Under my leadership, alongside Senators Jeff Merkley and Marco Rubio and Congressman Chris Smith, the Commission has continued to draw attention to the Chinese government's human rights violations and technology-enhanced authoritarianism. We passed my bill, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which seeks to address the genocide in Xinjiang, and we hope can serve as a model for future human rights legislation. We passed the Tibet Policy and Support Act to support the people of Tibet in their struggle against Chinese repression, and the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act to require the U.S. government to impose sanctions against mainland China and Hong Kong officials considered responsible for human rights abuses in Hong Kong. Now, everything that we accomplished at the CECC has been because that commission operates in a bipartisan manner with nonpartisan staff. Our comprehensive annual reports are widely respected by government officials, academics, and advocacy community, and the advocacy community, because they are well researched and they are fact-based. And that brings us to today. Mr. Speaker, we are here to consider the creation of a select committee. This select committee on China would investigate and submit policy recommendations on the status of China's economic, technological, and security progress, as well as its ongoing competition with the United States. I'll be honest, I have reservations here. Many of us have concerns about this turning into a committee that focuses on pushing Republican conspiracy theories and partisan talking points. We certainly don't want it to turn into a place that perpetuates anti-Asian hate. We cannot and we will not tolerate that. But instead, I would hope that this new committee would work in a similar fashion as the CECC, producing bipartisan work with a fact-based tone and approach that could be received by the international community seriously and substantively. And there are a few things I think the Select Committee needs to keep in mind if they truly want to be effective. First, President Trump repeatedly mislabeled COVID with racist language. Such rhetoric coincided with spikes in hate-based acts of violence and discrimination against people of Chinese or Asian origin across our country. This language has no place on this committee or anywhere in Congress. Second, this committee should not seek to focus solely on military solutions. Yes, China's military modernization is a legitimate issue, but that does not demand a military-first policy response. Third, I'm concerned that a committee focus myopically on the economic, technological, and security challenges of China could distract us from the need to build a holistic approach in many of these policy areas. We need to remember that the United States faces economic, technological, and security challenges from many different regions across the globe, not just China. And to focus solely on China, whether it be policy related to trade, tech, authoritarianism, or anything else, is neither analytically sound nor effective. Fourth and finally, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, said that if he were to chair this committee, he would focus on, I quote, ideological competition and human rights, end quote. And I would just like to say that human rights are not ideological. Human rights are fundamental and universal, protected by a vast body of international law, codified at the United Nations and widely adjudicated. They apply to every person in every country and territory on Earth. It is the Chinese Communist Party, in fact, that portrays human rights along an ideological divide. That falsely portrays Chinese values as something distinct from Western values in an effort to justify its repression of the people of China. It's important that the committee does not adopt the rhetoric of Chinese officials. So while I do have concerns here, after reading the resolution itself, I will be voting yes. The Democratic Party has led the way in implementing efforts to monitor China's compliance with international human rights and rule of law standards, and we will continue to do so here. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Kevin McCarthy of California.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Speaker. He looks very good up in there, too. Mr. Speaker, one of the greatest worries about the future is that we fall behind Communist China. The fact of the matter is, the danger posed by our dependence on China is dire. We spent decades passing policies that welcomed China into the global system. In return, China has exported oppression, aggression, and anti-Americanism. Today, the power of its military and economy are growing at the expense of freedom and democracy worldwide. It didn't start under this administration, but the current administration has clearly made it worse. Their policies has weakened our economy and made us more vulnerable to the threats of the CCP. But here's the good news. There is bipartisan consensus that the era of trusting Communist China is over. I listened to my friend, the gentleman across the aisle. I listened to your points of your concerns. Do not be concerned. Those are my same concerns as well, and they will not take place. I will tell the gentleman where the idea of all this was created. It was on a Codell to Normandy. I was there with then Speaker Nancy Pelosi, celebrating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And as you walked those hollow grounds of the crosses of the Star of David of these young American men, and you wondered what could have been done for that day never to take place, It dawned on me at that moment in time, there was an opportunity. Instead of American government not speaking with one voice, these different messages we've been providing, could we have a bipartisan committee that could look at all aspects from economics, where when we fell into COVID, not knowing whether we could have our medical supplies because China controlled so much, we learn of the farmland they are buying today, the stealing of our intellectual property. But we weaken ourselves when we fight which way to do it. Wouldn't it be better if we all came together? And for 9 months we worked on that. And we did get an agreement that we were going to start a bipartisan task force. We even had Washington Post come in and interview the members who were going to be on it. But unfortunately, the night before, then the majority party pulled back. You have my word and my commitment. This is not a partisan committee. This will be a bipartisan committee that is my hope, my desire, my wish that we speak with one voice, that we focus on the challenges that we have. How do we bring our jobs back from China to America? How do we secure our intellectual property? How do we make sure our farmland is protected? All of that would be brought up within this committee. The threat is too great for us to bicker with ourselves. The future should be determined by us. I've heard my colleagues on both sides say that the threat posed by Communist China is serious. I fully agree. This is an issue that transcends our political parties. And creating the Select Committee on China is our best avenue for addressing it. If you want to end our dependence on China, this committee will investigate it. You want to protect our national security, this committee will work on it. If you want to stop the theft of intellectual property and bring supply chains back to America, this committee will work to make it happen. Worried about Chinese propaganda in our schools and lobbying efforts in Washington, this committee will shine a bright light on it. Outraged that the CCP is buying American farmland, this committee will work to stop it. But they'll stop it with one voice. It's not one party saying it. It's America united, determining our own future. We want to stop trillions of American dollars from financing communist genocide and military modernization. The committee will work to prevent it, including by investigating how ESG benefits the CCP. The Select Committee on China will create the plan that will take us where we really need to go. It will get us all on the same page and move us in the right direction. Members of the Select Committee will work closely with their colleagues on every committee to get the job done. Is it partisan? Absolutely not. And to my friend across the aisle, if any time on the 5 items you listed that you feel something is challenging those, you come to me. Because that's not the intent and that's not what I'll put up with. I sat with the new leader on the Democrats and I told him early on of what this committee will be and who will be putting on it. We want serious lawmakers. This isn't for somebody to go in and be viral because they want to make some point. This is to work together as one Congress with one of our greatest challenges for the future. That no longer will we be dependent upon China, but no longer will we be as vulnerable. America will be stronger, dependent upon ourselves, and we will do this together. That's what the American people expect. I want this committee to last beyond who's in the majority and never, ever be decided that this is a partisan committee. You have my commitment. And at any times I feel whoever the leader puts on this committee on the other side, I told him I would approach him if I felt somebody on the other side was trying to make it partisan. Let's start with the right philosophy, with the right goals in mind, and let's work together to make it happen. I think if you will see, the chairman will be Mike Gallagher. This is a man who has sacrificed a lot. This is a man who's focused and studied. But this is a man who's not going to be partisan. We want the very best ideas. Doesn't matter where they come from. And at the end of the day, we don't need a majority and a minority report. We just need one philosophy with one principle, and America will be stronger for the future to come. And I want to thank you for your support. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Speaker for his assurances. At this point, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Barra.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you to my good friend from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern. I rise today to talk about the Select Committee on China and to support the Select Committee on China. These past two Congresses, I've had the privilege of being the chairman on the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific and a senior member on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Worked very closely with my ranking member, Steve Shabbat, good friend who we're going to miss, but also served as ranking member when Mr. Shabbat was chairman on that committee. And we've learned a lot in how we should approach China. We've looked at supply chains. We've traveled to the region. We've talked to our partners in Southeast Asia and ASEAN. We've understood the vulnerabilities. Our subcommittee had the first hearing on the novel coronavirus back in February of 2020 when we didn't have a name on it. So we understand the importance as a doctor of understanding the origins of COVID, where it came from, how we can best prevent the next pandemic. None of those questions are ones that we should be looking at and bickering about as Democratic or Republican questions. Those are questions that just make a lot of sense to our security, our economic strength, and where we go from here. So I applaud the Speaker's comments on wanting this to be an American strategy, not a Democratic or Republican strategy. If we look at our own history, what served us well in the Cold War is we had an American strategy. It didn't change every 2 years. It didn't change with the new presidential administration. We acted on it, we laid it out there, we executed it, and we won the Cold War without going to war. That's what the challenge is that faces us today. I wish China had gone a different direction. I wish they had opened up. I applaud the work that Mr. McGovern does on human rights and addressing the Uyghur genocide. Speaker Emeriti Pelosi has been a champion on looking at the human rights abuses and what the tragedy that's taking place in Tibet. Those are all issues that we should come together, not just as the United States of America, but with our allies and friends, because they have the same concerns. I don't want to say we're in a new Cold War, but we are in a real challenge right now. So I support the Select Committee. Let's make it nonpartisan, and let's work together to create an American strategy. Thank you, and I yield back.
Expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to my good friend, the distinguished member from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, and the chairman-designate of the proposed Select Committee.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding for his leadership. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.Res. 11 establishing a bipartisan Select Committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. In 1946, a great Wisconsinite, George Kennan, argued that dealing with the Soviet threat was the greatest task our diplomacy has ever faced, and probably the greatest it will ever have to face. Today, due to its aggression and its economic strength and our unique economic entanglement with it, the Chinese Communist Party represents an even greater test for American diplomacy. As Secretary of State Anthony Blinken put it last year, China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. The threat posed by the CCP is not abstract. The CCP's aggression is not limited to Taiwan, the South China Sea, Hong Kong, or even Xinjiang, where two successive administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, have determined that the CCP is engaging in genocide. We see this aggression here at home, where the party has stolen American intellectual property, technology, and industrial capacity, undermining our economy and good-paying American jobs. It is here at home where the party's extraterritorial totalitarianism terrorizes Chinese students studying at our universities and targets Americans of Chinese descent. And it is here at home where thousands of Americans are poisoned each year by fentanyl precursors manufactured in China and distributed thanks to a complex Chinese money laundering network. It is time to understand the urgency of the threat. It is time to reclaim our economic independence in key areas. The Select Committee will expose the CCP's coordinated whole-of-society strategy to undermine American leadership and American sovereignty while working on a bipartisan basis and with the committees of jurisdiction to identify long overdue, common-sense approaches to counter CCP aggression. And I stress working on a bipartisan basis because that's the only way we're going to be successful over the long term. The CCP doesn't pose a danger to just Republicans or Democrats. It's a threat to all Americans. And I commend my colleague for his work on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That is one of the most consequential, significant pieces of legislation that we've passed on a bipartisan basis in recent years. And it's up to us to ensure that it's fully implemented. And there's much work to be done on that front. We need to have a united front here in Congress to counter the Chinese Communist Party. And in so doing, at every step along the way, we must make sure that we are drawing a distinction between the party and the Chinese people, with whom we have no quarrel, and who are often the primary victims of CCP aggression and repression. In sum, there is no more critical challenge facing our nation today. I am grateful to Speaker McCarthy for his leadership in establishing this Select Committee, for giving me the mission of ensuring this stays bipartisan. You've heard his sincerity in wanting this to be an area where Republicans and Democrats can work together. I would also like to thank Chairman Mike McCall, who chaired the China Task Force and did a phenomenal job. We are building upon the foundation that he laid with the China Task Force, and I look forward to working with him as this effort moves forward. And I urge my colleagues to support this critical legislation. I look forward to working with my Democratic colleagues. I see many friends sitting on the other side of the chamber, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is
Mr.
recognized.
Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Thank you,
The gentleman is
Mr.
recognized.
Speaker. I rise in support of the creation of the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party. I rise as a research scientist who's participated in many international collaborations, which included some brilliant Chinese scientists. And I rise also as a businessman who founded a high-tech manufacturing business that now provides over 1,000 good-paying American manufacturing jobs, and has kept those manufacturing jobs in America despite having to compete in the world markets with cloned Chinese products for over 2 decades. And I have watched with consternation as our business's electronic supply chain has been increasingly dependent upon China. Now, it was not a stupid thing for our country and the countries of the free world to attempt to help China become a free and open country by integrating it into the international economy and into the international scientific research community, and to open our doors to Chinese students and scholars. In the years since World War II, that approach has succeeded in turning many previously autocratic countries into free democracies around the world. In fact, in previous years, China took a number of steps towards becoming a free and open country, but in recent years, it has turned back towards autocracy. So it is time to respond to that reality and to take thoughtful action. On a personal note, my wife is Korean and is a scientist who has contributed at the highest levels of scientific research and science policy in the United States. And the only reason that she is free today is that 2 generations ago, the U.S. and the free countries of the world stood up against communism in Korea. But nothing is more self-defeating than the anti-Asian racism that sometimes creeps into the debate in our country. The frontiers that we should be defending are not the good old US of A, but the free democracies of the world. So I rise in support of this new Select Committee on the Strategic
Gentleman's time has
Competition,
expired.
and in particular on the clear distinction that it
time has
makes,
expired.
even in its title, between the Communist Party of China
time
and
has
the people of
expired.
China, who are not the enemy.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 4 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I thank my friend from Oklahoma. And Mr. Speaker, the Chinese Communist Party is intent on replacing the United States as the world's preeminent economic, military, and technological power. They have a sophisticated plan to challenge American hegemony and leverage every possible avenue to finance their goals. Defending against these advances is one of the most significant geopolitical challenges of a generation. So today, the House, led by Speaker Kevin McCarthy, is voting to establish a Select Committee on China to do just that. This Select Committee will examine the threats from the Chinese Communist Party with a fine-tooth comb and expose them for the American people and for the whole world to fully understand. In addition, we will develop concrete solutions for how we can better position the United States to prevail in this competition and ensure that the 21st century is led by the United States and defined by a rules-based international order. The stakes are high, and the CCP's list of offenses against the norms of international order are long, from violating an international treaty and dismantling Hong Kong's civil liberties, egregious zero-tolerance COVID-19 restrictions in mainland China that led to mass protests with brutal crackdowns from CCP authorities, oppressing ethnic minorities, persecuting Uyghurs and Tibetans, conducting increasingly belligerent provocations on land, air, and in cyberspace, using debt trap diplomacy through the Belt and Road Initiative to assert colonial dominance over lesser developed countries, engaging in economic warfare through unfair trade practices, the theft of $600 billion of intellectual property from American businesses each year through the forced transfer of technology, threatening through military, economic, and diplomatic coercion the democracy in Taiwan. And last year and the year before, the threat from the CCP came into focus when the CCP silenced doctors, corrupted the World Health Organization to spread disinformation, cover up substandard biosecurity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, leading to a deadly virus becoming a global pandemic, killing millions, devastating the global economy, and giving the CCP the opportunity to weaponize the global supply chain against the West. But many Americans may not be aware that Beijing's malign activities are fueled in part by unwitting American investors. In 2020, $120 billion of U.S. foreign direct investment flowed into China from American businesses and investors. Mr. Speaker, the United States is the economic envy of the world because we possess a capitalist free market economy, the deepest, most competitive liquid capital markets on planet Earth. And this empowers individual investors and businesses to make decisions for themselves. But we cannot allow Wall Street, banks, asset managers, global equity index providers to fuel the rise of the CCP military and surveillance companies hell-bent on targeting Americans. These companies pose an imminent and growing threat to American national security and the security of our allies. And that's why I will be reintroducing the Chinese Military and Surveillance Company Sanctions Act of 2021 in the 118th Congress, legislation that uses the economic power of the United States through OFAC to sanction Chinese companies that threaten U.S. national security. I commend Speaker McCarthy for following through on his promise to create this Select Committee, for naming Congressman Mike Gallagher chairman of the committee, who has been a fighter on the front lines and will do a great job leading this committee. I will close with this. Every president, from Harry Truman to George H.W. Bush, understood the need to confront the threat from the Soviet Union and defend the United States and our principles against communism. Because of that bipartisan commitment and because of the strength and vitality of the American system, our nation was victorious in the Cold War. We must come together again as Republicans and Democrats to confront
the gentleman's time has expired.
And I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy in permitting me to speak on this. I come to the floor much encouraged, having heard the words of the Speaker and the Chairman-designate of Mr. Gallagher. I was one of those people 25 years ago who was part of the consensus that we could engage Communist China into the world economy. I had an opportunity to travel extensively, meeting with the Chinese leadership at that time. They were saying the right things. I think some of them were sincere. It was an encouraging opportunity. But over the course of the last 20 years, it's taken a wrong turn. We have watched the Chinese play a cynical game. They have not lived up to their obligations under the WTO. We don't have a procurement provision, for example. We've watched repression increase, and we've watched this current regime in unprecedented ways exploit opportunities. I had legislation to close the de minimis loophole that allows China to import 2 million packages a day, untaxed and uninspected. And heaven only knows, in terms of forced labor, in terms of illicit goods that are coming in here. And I've had legislation to try and change that. I think this select committee can be a forum to bring us together in a nonpartisan basis to take areas in which there is profound agreement, like closing the de minimis loophole. I commend the Speaker and the leadership moving forward. I look forward to working with Democratic leadership on this, to use it as an opportunity to get us back on track, particularly given the insidious nature of the current regime, forced labor. We've made great progress legislatively to give us more tools. I think there's the potential for this select committee to build on it and make more progress, and I look forward to working with them. I will support the proposal. Thank you very much.
Time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 90 seconds to my very good friend, distinguished member from Montana, Mr. Zinke.
Gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of the Select Committee on China. As a 23-year veteran of the United States Navy and a former Navy SEAL commander, I'm acquainted with China and its looming threat. Without question, China's actions represent a threat not only to national security, but also our environment. As Secretary of Interior, I led a delegation of officials to the Pacific Islands and witnessed firsthand China's intentions. And I can tell you their intentions are clear: control and dominance of the South China Sea and the hemisphere. It should be noted that China has the largest standing United States largest standing Navy, greater than the United States. It has stolen U.S. technology and has increased their capacity for nuclear weapons. And China continues to threaten democracies such as Taiwan, the Philippines, and even our territories. On the environmental front, the People's Republic of China is the world's largest emission of greenhouse gases, the largest source of marine debris, the worst perpetrators of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and is the world's largest consumer of trafficked wildlife and timber products. In fact, 90% of the world's plastics come from 4 rivers in China. China's actions today represent a clear and present danger, and they use any means available to them: blackmail, data hacking, and espionage. It's time to act in a bipartisan way, and I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in supporting this critical bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. McGovern. Mr. Speaker, there's broad recognition among Democrats and Republicans that Congress must adopt a whole-of-government approach in response to the intensifying great power competition between the United States and China. The formation of the Select Committee is the Republicans' response to the China question. However, I do remain skeptical of the true intentions behind the formation of this committee, and I hope my Republican colleagues can approach this topic from a position of strength, not weakness, xenophobia, or fear. A specific focus on the strategic competition with China could be meaningful if the committee's work remains constructive, but I question why the work of this proposed select committee could not have been done through the current committees of jurisdiction. But that being said, to be constructive, the committee should consider perspectives beyond the military domain that include the political, economic, cultural, and diplomatic implications of a potential U.S. response. Republican leadership should also select members to sit on this committee who are serious-minded about the risks posed by China and not merely anti-China hawks yearning to isolate China through military might. Most importantly, it is my hope that the committee will consider meaningful ways that we can promote a rules-based international order that the United States has spent considerable time and resources building up in the post-World War II era. We must leverage our soft power tools and work cooperatively with our allies and other democratically aligned partners across the globe to achieve our ends. Finally, unity at home is just as important to demonstrating the strength of our nation as it is to project our strength abroad. Our strength is derived from our unwavering commitment to our democratic values, the cohesion of our alliances, the intellect and innovation of our people, and the shared prosperity of every American. And what grants us currency with the world is our credibility at home as a reliable partner that provides robust social safety net for its people and consistently supports democratic ideals. Mr. Speaker, I urge my Republican colleagues to take this opportunity seriously. It is not simply enough to demonize and humanize our adversaries, to align the world behind our democratic ideals. Let's use this select committee to show that we have unity and strength to outrival China and that we're good for more than just fearful rhetoric. And until this point, our Republican colleagues have shown their unwillingness to avoid the vitriol that undermines the constructive approach. So I plan to vote no on this resolution. However, I hope we can move forward in a constructive way.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise to address the growing threat posed to the American people by the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. Let us be clear. The greatest influence, the greatest challenge that we face from an outside source today is from the Chinese Communist Party. From intellectual property theft to deceptive trade practices, the acquisition of farmland to the consideration of rare earth minerals industry into one consolidated outside firm, the Chinese Communist Party continues to pose these challenges to America as we speak. But Americans are waking up to the threat. From combating global public health threats to defending our networks and equipping Americans to lead in global innovation, we must act now to confront the growing threat of the CCP. Having served on the China Task Force, I was proud to work with my colleagues to address these challenges. Together, we delivered over 400 common sense and workable solutions to help address the challenges that we certainly recognize we face today. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we worked to shed light on the vulnerabilities of our medical supply chain. We worked to strengthen our national security, protect our American values, and secure our place in the international leadership for years to come. Now, it's time to continue that mission by creating the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the CCP. This Select Committee will finally give the threats posed by the CCP their due congressional attention and ensure that American innovation and American ingenuity continue to outpace the threats to global security and global stability that is perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution.
The gentleman's time has expired.
And I yield.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
As chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or CAPAC, I rise to address the creation of this Select Committee on the strategic competition between the U.S. and the Communist Party of China. CAPAC strongly supports strengthening our economy and national security, and we have always recognized that there are legitimate concerns with the actions of the government of the People's Republic of China. This committee could address these issues productively. However, I rise to remind all members that this committee should not be used as an open invitation to traffic in blatant xenophobic anti-China rhetoric that we know results in physical violence against Asian Americans. We certainly saw this with Trump's labeling of COVID as the China virus, resulting in 11,500 hate crimes against AAPIs in this country. This committee cannot be used to promote policies that result in the racial profiling of Asian Americans, but should directly focus on specific concerns related to the government of the People's Republic of China. We know the danger for Asian American communities if the committee devolves into xenophobic rhetoric and scapegoating. Back in the 1980s, when the economic competition between the U.S. and Japan reached a boiling point, Vincent Chin was out at a bar in Detroit celebrating his upcoming wedding, when two laid-off auto workers shouted, "It's because of you that we lost our jobs." These men harassed Vincent, chased him, and bashed him in his head with a baseball bat, beating him until he died. Neither of them served a day in jail and only paid a $3,000 fine. Instead of attending his wedding, Vincent's family attended his funeral. This is part of our country's history. And what this shows is what we say and how we say it matters. And we know how dangerous the consequences can be if we don't get this right. Well, thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hood.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.Res. 11, establishing the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the CCP. As a member of the China Task Force in the 116th and 117th Congresses and a member of the House Intelligence Committee, this committee is long overdue, and I commend Speaker McCarthy for putting it together. A clear and dedicated focus on issues surrounding the strategic competition between the United States and China has never been more important. I would make 3 observations. 1, make no mistake about it, Mr. Speaker, China has a plan to replace us, and they're working on it every single day in technology, national security, and in economics. And the longer we go without addressing those issues, the further we fall behind. Number 2, look at the allies that Xi Jinping and the CCP align themselves with. Putin in Russia, who's a war criminal. Iran. You talk about the unbreakable bond they have with Russia as it relates to the Ukraine conflict. They would want nothing more than to see the West lose in this conflict. Number 3, I hope this Select Committee looks at how we can use our economic power in the United States in the trade space, working with our like-minded allies in the Indo-Pacific region, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Indonesia. We have been asleep at the wheel when it comes to the economic power we should be using in the region. Finally, China continues to exploit democratic norms and standards throughout the region, engages in economic manipulation of the global marketplace, and threatens global peace and security efforts. This Select Committee is more important than ever to ensure the United States does not continue to delay our focus on the true needs of our strategic competition with China. I strongly support the Select Committee, and I urge adoption of the resolution, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this Select Committee. As an Asian American who represents the only Asian majority district in the continental United States, I would never support a committee that I thought would engage in xenophobia or attacks on the Chinese people. But I am pleased that this committee is not directed against China, but is directed against the Chinese Communist Party in the crafting of the language. And I am pleased that it's going to focus on things that have been a bipartisan concern, human rights violations that Representative McGovern has advocated in standing up to the Uyghurs, the fact that this country has lost our industrial base. For 40 years, on a bipartisan basis, we watched as jobs were shipped offshore, factories shut down, our trade deficits going from $70 billion to almost $400 billion. That has hurt the working class. It's hurt our ability to be a superpower, and it has led to rising tensions with China. If we want to deal with Asian hate in this country, one of the things we need to do is rebalance our production. It's the loss of our jobs that has fueled some of the xenophobia. It's the loss of those jobs that fueled the killing that Representative Chu talked about in Michigan with Vincent Chang. I believe this committee can not only stand up for American interests, I believe when done well, it can help get us to peace and reduce the tensions with China by rebalancing trade, by ensuring that China doesn't invade Taiwan, and by standing up for human rights. And I am pleased on a personal basis that Representative Gallagher will be chair of that. We have had heated debates in the Armed Services Committee. We don't agree on many things, but I know that he's a Marine, a patriot, and someone who is going to make sure that the committee is focused on the issues.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend, the distinguished gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, I thank the distinguished Chairman, Mr. Cole, and Speaker. I rise in support of the creation of this bipartisan select committee on strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. And like my friend from California, the title is fundamental here. This is a policy dispute between our government and the Chinese Communist Party, not China, not the Chinese people. Most Americans have great affinity for the Chinese people, their industriousness, technical talent, both in China and as citizens abroad. And the United States has a long history of partnership with China in the 19th century as a partner in trade, during World War II as an ally, and our support of their growth over the past 5 decades. But today, as a great power and as an ancient civilization, China has been perverted by the modern leadership of Leader for Life Xi and the CCP. Sadly, this has been manifested by rampant intellectual property theft, overburdening developing nations through corrupt credit practices, manipulation of the facts in Wuhan, punishment of religious thought, and the collapse of the rule of law in one of the freest places on the globe, Hong Kong, and perhaps most offensively, genocide of the Uyghurs and others. During the pandemic, we have witnessed the severe vulnerability of the world's global supply chain as being far too reliant on China for minerals, for pharmaceuticals, for medical supplies, for almost everything. This select committee will work to address the possible strategies and meet and counter Xi's posture. I urge all my colleagues to support its creation. I wish Chairman Gallagher well in his mission, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding the time, and I rise in strong opposition to the H.R. Res. 11, which would create a select committee on China. The only reason why we are creating this select committee on China is because extremist MAGA Republicans in last week's circular firing squad election for Speaker, the Speaker had to promise to allow creation of this committee. And so what I fear, because we've known for a long time, we've watched China rise. We know their activities. We know what kind of competition they pose us economically, national security, intellectual property, human rights, all of these issues. We know where we stand with China, and each of those issues are covered by jurisdiction, by committees of jurisdiction that exist right now. And any investigation that is done can be done through the existing committees. So why are we creating this committee? I fear that it is to create a platform to unleash anti-Asian hate and division. And this committee should not be used as an open invitation to engage and traffic in blatantly xenophobic anti-Asian rhetoric that we know historically results in violence against the Asian people in this country. And so that is the reason why I oppose this, the the creation of this select committee. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my very good friend, distinguished gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Sparks.
The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Select Committee on China. In February of last year, President Xi of China and President Putin of Russia issued a joint statement redefining democracy and proclaiming that, quote, a trend has emerged towards redistribution of power in the world, close quote. We must take this statement seriously. Also in February of last year, the White House released its annual report on domestic supply chains, highlighting the heavy reliance of many U.S. industries of China. For example, China provides more than 70% of certain pesticides, and 3 Chinese companies account for 96% of the world's dry cargo. The recent COVID pandemic underlined our dependencies on vital medications, like 90% of U.S. antibiotic imports are from China. Such heavy dependency on any country would be a major risk, but being dependent on a communist country with expansionist policies is a significant national security risk. We must address it. I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend. Mr. Speaker, it's my hope that this Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and China will be a sober and comprehensive engagement of the very important challenge China poses to American security and prosperity and that of our allies, and not a cynical descent into the worst impulses of Republican oversight efforts. This Select Committee offers us an opportunity for this body to assess and act on how the United States can compete with the CCP on advanced manufacturing trade, emerging technologies, leading the world in competition between democracy versus of NATO's legislative arm. I was proud.
Its annual report on domestic supply chains, highlighting the heavy reliance of many U.S. industries of China. For example, China provides more than 70% of certain pesticides, and 3 Chinese companies account for 96% of the world's dry.
Use this committee as a venue to express bipartisan support for Taiwan's democracy, independence, and territorial sovereignty, instead of driving wedges that can only advance the interests of those we seek to expose. Using this committee to drive partisan wedges would be a missed opportunity, and I'm hopeful we will not do that. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to tackle the geopolitical question of our generation and to make this a bipartisan inquiry and effort. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my very good friend and distinguished veteran in service to the United States, now in the Congress of the United States, Mr. Walz of Florida.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we know the activities of the Chinese Communist Party under the leadership of Xi, the worst genocide since World War II. Not just according to the United States, multiple administrations of the United States, but also according to the UN, Hong Kong, South China Sea, threats to India, threats to Taiwan. Xi is telling his country to prepare for war. Here at home, we have the cornering of critical supply chains and dependencies on China that is being done deliberately as they steal their way to the top through our intellectual property, spying on the Federal Reserve, flooding our key institutions, including academia, with money, buying up farmland. Mr. Chairman, this is a whole of government, whole of society challenge that we have never before faced in American history. And that's why we need a committee like this. That's why we need a committee that spans all of these jurisdictions, and we certainly need the leadership of my good friend and colleague, Representative Mike Gallagher.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves.
I reserve.
From Massachusetts is recognized.
I reserve my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my very good friend who also has rendered distinguished service to our country in uniform, Mr. Mills of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come to the floor today to talk about the economic resource warfare that the CCP has launched against the United States. As a former business owner, I can tell you the CCP continues to steal hundreds of billions of dollars in intellectual property from American companies with no consequence. Under the current weak administration, who has lost credibility on the world stage after the failed Afghan withdrawal, they have shown no course of action to combat these issues. But there is a plan now. Thanks to the American people who have elected a Republican majority, I am happy to support this established select committee to hold the CCP accountable. I am committed to putting this back ahead of the malign and Chinese aggressions. While this resolution is just a start, we need to also look at mitigating Chairman Xi's One Road, One Belt initiative and increase domestic production to offset our GDP to national debt ratio while unleashing American energy production and strengthening the U.S. dollar. This bill is a common sense approach that will put America first and stop adversarial reliance on nations who intend to eliminate the U.S. dollar from being the global currency, cut off the Western Hemisphere supply chains, and advance China's goal of a hegemony. Let's get this done and put America first. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2.5 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished member from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, for over 3 decades post-Tiananmen Square massacre, Congress was deeply divided, not between Republican and Democrats, but among the majority here and in the Senate, who favored unfettered engagement and trade without serious human rights conditionality. Indeed, President Clinton delinked human rights and trade on May 26, 1994. I went up there and gave a press conference. I was joined by a few others saying how serious that was to give up on human rights and allow profits to trump human rights. We've seen the brutal nature of the communist regime, especially under Xi Jinping, and the Chinese Communist Party's ultimate desire to see hegemony. Over the years, I've chaired 76 congressional hearings on China and authored several pieces of legislation, including the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and was the Republican sponsor of Jim McGovern's Uyghur Forced Labor Act. We now have to make sure those laws are being faithfully implemented. 20 years ago, when China became a member of the WTO, most members of Congress, and certainly in the business, in the community and foreign policy establishment, bought into what James Mann rightfully called the China fantasy. In other words, if you just trade more with the dictatorship, somehow they'll matriculate into a democracy. That fantasy has been shown to be demonstrably naive at best. The CCP has become more powerful because of the trade and dual-use items that have accrued over there that are now being used by their military and by their police. I would note parenthetically, I chaired 2 hearings on why China should not be invited into the WTO, and no one listened. The record is clear, Mr. Speaker. As predicted, we have become more like them, and thankfully that is changing, but many in our corporate establishment, we saw with the Olympics, were standing right by Beijing and the CCP and Xi Jinping, wouldn't utter a word, including Coca-Cola and others, about the terrible killing of the Uyghurs and the use of forced labor camp. We have stood by as the Chinese Embassy and the Ministry of State Security have harassed people of Chinese heritage and nationality living lawfully in the United States. We have not done all that we could do for the people of Hong Kong, Tibet, and the Uyghur people in the autonomous region. But today, thankfully, we are turning a page. And I want to applaud our Speaker for pushing hard for this select committee, and hopefully it will make a difference. Yield back.
Expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, if I could inquire from the gentleman from Oklahoma whether he has any more speakers.
I'd advise my friend I'm prepared to close whenever he is.
Mr. Speaker,
the gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I will yield myself the remaining time.
The gentleman is recognized.
So, Mr. Speaker, this select committee has the potential to do some substantive work. And there is a bipartisan group here in this House that for years has been focused on holding China accountable and upholding a high standard of human rights. And I don't want to close without acknowledging the incredible leadership of Speaker Pelosi in all of this. I traveled with Speaker Pelosi to China a few years back, and she insisted that we visit Tibet, a place that was blocked off for congressional visits for many, many years. She refused to take no for an answer, and we went to Tibet. And under her leadership, the legislation that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, was passed. The most consequential legislation to hold China accountable passed in this Congress in history. But the potential that this Select Committee has really is contingent on making sure that the words that were expressed by Speaker McCarthy and by incoming Chair Gallagher are actually upheld. The concern that you hear on our side really is concern that this devolves into something that is about promoting conspiracy theories and that tolerates racist language. And we say that because we've been through all this. The former president, through the use of the words that he chose to employ, resulted in hate crimes against Asian Americans in this country. It is unconscionable. And if that committee goes in that direction, I will assure you that the Democrats on that committee will push back forcefully. We want this committee to be effective. In theory, this is a committee that we should all get behind, and I hope that it is successful. I hope that it is bipartisan. I hope that it is all that we have been promised here today. As I said, I am going to vote for this because I think it is the right thing to do. And I have faith that our members on both sides will do the right thing. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote their conscience. I'm going to vote yes on this, and I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking my friend for the debate and for his tremendous work in holding China accountable in the human rights area. And I'm certainly confident the Speaker will do as he said, and we'll have a committee both sides can be proud of. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I urge all my colleagues to support this resolution creating a select committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. It's beyond dispute that Communist China poses an urgent generational threat to United States interests and values. America has become far too economically dependent on China in recent decades, and as a result, our supply chains have become dangerously fragile. We must urgently take steps to secure our supply chains and bring them home. The Chinese Communist Party continues to push the envelope, both in the United States and abroad. They steal American intellectual property, they build spy networks and propaganda machines on American soil, they threaten our allies in Asia and in the South China Sea, and they have spread their influence throughout the developing world, seeking to ensnare vulnerable developing countries in debt-trap diplomacy. Mr. Speaker, the time has come for the House of Representatives to take a comprehensive look at Communist China. We must build on the excellent work done by the China Task Force in 2019 and 2020. We must investigate China's actions and respond appropriately to ensure America confronts this very grave threat. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time and urge all members to vote yes on this resolution.
The gentleman from Oklahoma yields back the balance of his time. Pursuant to House Resolution 5, the previous question is ordered on the resolution. The question is on agreeing to the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it.
Okay. Good.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
I was going to ask for the yeas and nays, too.
Just wanted to make sure.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.